officially in home stretch. It's now time for the final segment, which includes our annual Leadership Outlook conversation with Lamar, Clear Channel, and Outfront CEOs. And this conversation today is going to be moderated by Brian Wieser, CEO and principal at Madison & Wall, and a true thought leader. Before the panel, Brian will frame things up with insights on the shifting dynamics among brands, agencies, and media owners, and some predictions about what this means for how money will flow in a rapidly transforming marketing and media ecosystem. And of course, following that, he will introduce, to join him on stage, Sean, Scott, and Nick. But first up, please welcome Brian to the stage.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for sticking around. I think we're like nearly the very end of this event. I'm sorry I missed the first couple days of this. Sounds like it's been a fantastic conference. Hopefully I won't depress you too much with what I'm about to say, but believe it or not, there is some positivity inside of an otherwise negative kind of view on the world. So first of all, let's just get into it. All right, so how does advertising actually grow, right? Mark Zuckerberg, I respect. I wouldn't want to get into a jiu-jitsu match with him. Is not what I would say a true student of the advertising industry relative to some people such as those who are on stage right now. He has argued that artificial intelligence will make advertising a meaningfully larger share of global GDP than it is today. This was last week. And it got a lot of attention for a bunch of reasons. Now, again, as someone who's probably studied this more than any other living human being, I dare you to find anyone else, I don't agree. These are the three factors, and we'll tie this to outdoor advertising in a moment. Underlying economic conditions, creative destruction of economies, and I don't mean the end of J. Walter Thompson, competitive intensity within categories. Those are the three things, right? So economic activity, creative destruction, and competitive intensity. So let's just talk a bit about what's going on in the economy. And this helps inform how I'm thinking about, and we at Madison & Wall are thinking about the ad market presently and in the near term going forward. So we did bring down our numbers quite a bit in December following the election. And this seemed kind of obvious to us, and it seemed like the rest of the world just kind of caught up the last 2 months. But these were things that were mostly pretty evident back then. So what do we have going on right now, right? We have reduced policy certainty, right? Because policies are quite volatile. Even if you know the general direction, the lack of definitive policy is difficult for companies to make investments around. You do have erosion of the rule of law, right? And these are apolitical statements, right? Take the TikTok situation. Pretty unambiguously, that's contrary to the rule of law, a lack of due process in certain situations. Businesses should not assume this doesn't apply to them going forward. Reduction in global trade, clearly negative, right? Supply chains, clearly getting tightened up, and more to point, the dependencies that businesses have on integrated supply chains with the rest of the world are really important. And breaking those up in as rapid a manner as we're seeing, especially between Canada and the US, are really, really negative. Even if they haven't happened, the threat of it happening is enough, right, to cause a real contraction of at least investment, if not activity. And of course, we haven't even gotten to deportations yet and what that does for the labor supply. Again, an apolitical statement, but to say if you do follow through, as the administration is likely to do here, this does have negative consequences for supply chains, right? All right, so lower regulation, I guess that's positive to the extent that, at least in some categories, where maybe you'll get more crypto and you'll get more meme coins, and they might become big advertising categories as they have been in the past. And you might have other categories where it's just everything's looser, for better and for largely worse, one could argue. But for advertising, it can actually be quite positive, as we saw in prior eras, like take sports betting and other new categories that come into existence when there are just fewer restrictions. Of course, the offset might be the pharma industry. Sorry, pharma. We'll see where that goes. So that's the one positive you could point to. M&A, going into December, we certainly did argue that it seemed more likely than not that even though there was a good chance that the new administration would shift away from the policies of the prior administration on many matters, it actually seems a lot closer, right? Remember, J.D. Vance did praise Lina Khan, and you see a lot of similarities in how the current FTC and DOJ is approaching M&A, and you see a more politicized process in a lot of these transactions. And so it's not anywhere near as friendly, if you will. Now, with that said, that could be either negative or positive, because in some categories, when you get M&A, you actually have reduced advertising, right? If Albertsons and Kroger had come together, that actually would have reduced advertising, probably. But in other situations, it helps concentrate industry, and it actually can be positive for advertising. So, these are factors. Importantly, corporate taxes coming down or going up makes almost no difference. I dare anyone in this room to show me any empirical evidence whatsoever that over any extended period of time in any country that changes in tax policies have a direct impact on the advertising industry. Short answer is it doesn't. It's these other factors we'll get to that have a much bigger impact, but tax policy doesn't actually matter when it comes to actual spending on advertising. Let's separate that from what is economically efficient and what does well for the individual sellers of advertising, but when it comes to actual revenue generated, it doesn't make any difference. So we have these really negative conditions that, again, back in December, what we did when we brought our numbers down after the election, we were saying we're looking at a stagflationary economy in the best case scenario. And the base case, to be clear, right? Now, there are all sorts of other risks to the economy from the process by which policies have been implemented. Because the whole run on the bond market that we saw, we haven't seen the last of that. Current policies are destructive to capital, will contribute to capital flight, will contribute to currency challenges, and there are other negative consequences that fall from that. This will create opportunities, by the way. We'll get to the positives. Don't worry. But these are really negative things at a macro level. All right, so just hitting on the example of creative destruction. And again, why creative destruction matters for the advertising economy. Again, this is the Joseph Schumpeter concept of it. Consider, for example, that retailers, brick and mortar retailers, allocate about 1% of their revenue to advertising in the United States. Online-based retailers allocate about 4% of their revenue to advertising. If you have a 3% growth rate for, say, retail, this is just illustrative, 3% growth in retail sales, right? But you have a shift every year of the mix of bricks and mortar versus online commerce. That goes this 5% shift every year, and you go from a 95-5 to a 50-50 split over a decade. You end up with a category, retail, that actually grows by nearly 10% every year. That's creative destruction in motion, right? And it's one of the most important factors that has supported the growth of advertising over the 2010s, right? It wasn't just that. There was also cross-border trade, and Chinese advertisers in particular. This is a topic I've been on since at least 2013, especially as Meta started pushing self-service advertising more and more aggressively. It was very, very clear that they were generating a ton of revenue from there, from Vietnam, a few other places, and it was new when it came to the overall ad market. Now, the demand for advertising was effectively displacing demand from advertising that would have come from domestic competitors, essentially. And so we want to be mindful of this, too, when it comes to the overall health of the ad market. And again, it's an apolitical statement to just say, well, for better and worse, like if you put high tariffs on Chinese imports, you change the de minimis exemption, you will have, more likely than not, negative consequences on the overall ad market. Now, primarily, it impacts retail media, right? And keep in mind, 2/3 of retail media is Amazon. My guess, probably close to half, maybe 40% of Amazon's ad revenue is dependent on this cross-border activity. Meta, the number is a smaller percentage, but probably similar in absolute numbers, like $10 billion a year. And so we can talk about how that's evolving, but it is important to be mindful of those elements of creative destruction, the shift of more competitively intense categories or subcategories because of the competitive dynamics. replacing older categories with less competitive intensity. And that relates to this other point. If you're selling advertising, you would rather have the situation on the left than on the right, right? A smaller market with 4 players versus a larger market with 2. Because 2 players can tacitly collude. And because very few marketers that I'm aware of ever wake up and say, I can't wait to go spend me some money on advertising, right? Anyone know any who do that? Like just, they love spending money? I mean, some do, but I guess not that many. The reality is that most marketers will spend money on advertising because it's better than the alternative of not spending money on advertising, right? You don't want to lose share in a category. And if you can't anticipate what your competitor is going to do, or in cases where you have an upstart that's just totally unpredictable inside of a category, you're better off spending money on advertising, right? And that's where you get this higher competitive intensity. Now, these lessons are important when it comes to, when you think about how to facilitate growth, if you will, in a given subsector, right? The more you create competitive intensity, direct competitors will react to perceived risks of loss of share. And so anywhere you're able to find these micro categories, you can actually drive outsized growth. I mean, we've seen this, certainly more at the national level. I've observed it firsthand. Think of certainly the telecom industry in countries around the world. When you had 4 or 5 players competing at a national level, not at a regional level, but at a national level, they can't quite anticipate what each other are doing. You have a much faster growth rate than, say, in some countries where you have consolidation down to 2 or 3, right? You get much more robust advertising in that competitive oligopoly situation. Similarly, in the auto insurance sector, right? You had a boring, predictable industry in the 90s, and then all of a sudden, Geico comes from out of nowhere, right? Catalyzes everyone to do all sorts of unpredictable things, and now you have a ton of billion-dollar, near billion-dollar marketers, all of which are incredibly competitive from an ad spend perspective. So I think there's some lessons there to think about in terms of how you can actually generate growth. But these 3 factors, economic activity, creative destruction, and competitive intensity inside of categories, matter. AI, I'm not that AI doesn't, and we can talk about that. AI doesn't really matter, right? Only to the degree that it causes changes in those 3 things. You're welcome, Mr. Zuckerberg. All right, so back to the election and its consequences. So yeah, this is an illustration of where we were. Now, the numbers don't look that bad or that much different, right? So in our September forecast, we still were recognizing that 2025 would be challenged by, frankly, difficult comparables. 2024 was a very, very strong year, both economically and in terms of the overall ad market. Necessarily, there had to be some deceleration. But we brought the numbers down by quite a bit in December. And so the big change, though, is that because we're expecting stagflation, that means like no real underlying economic growth and higher inflation. So it looks a little bit better. When we say a 4% nominal growth rate, ex-political, but you've got, say, 3 or 4% inflation, that's not as good as getting, say, 2% real GDP and 2% inflation. Anyways, it's not a great environment. Now, the things that matter for this room in particular, as negative as this overall view is, and again, there are worse outcomes than this. I don't see any positive upside surprises. The important thing to keep in mind is that in this world with downside risks, if you're selling ads, you want to lock in as much revenue as you can sooner rather than later, because the risks to the downside are pretty meaningful. And at the same time, if you're in the business of capturing real estate or you're locking in real estate, you might want to wait. I don't claim to be an expert on real estate, but I do know that in the world that I've just described, by the time the rest of the market figures this out, and remember, most of Wall Street is in a bit of an echo chamber and playing a game of telephone, but by the time the rest of the world gets to this place that I feel is incredibly inevitable, it feels just like January, February 2020 coming into the pandemic. You knew it was coming. That will present opportunities. And so you want to delay those commitments for real estate or other expenses that you can until later, because I think opportunities will be better. Anyways, just moving forward quickly. And again, I think these slides will be available because I know we only have a few more minutes here. So marketers absolutely have a wide range of things that they say they want. We track in Madison Wall for our subscribers to our newsletters and our advisory services what CEOs and CFOs of public companies say. And you've heard all these things, but we've taken it directly from the mouths of the CEOs and CFOs. But what they actually do, well, again, what drives advertising shifts into these different media, mostly digital, that's not including digital out of home, fashion or preferences, groupthink, least bad alternatives. It's not about performance for the most part. It's about a whole bunch of other factors that are best understood through the lens of a political analysis, if you will, of how corporate decision-making occurs. Meanwhile, agencies are still growing. They're not dead. They're still important. They're still going to be out there. Keep in mind their commercial models are evolving, and keep in mind the consequences of consolidation. That can present both opportunities and threats. I would argue that as the biggest agency holding companies consolidate, that will mean that they'll be a bit more unified, especially when it comes to things like principle-based trading, which I think should present greater opportunities for the outdoor advertising industry to the extent that you can work together with agencies. Finally, for media owners, we kind of laid out what we think the growth rate is for the overall ad market. But when we look at where there's opportunities, it's really important to keep in mind that when it comes to where the market is really going, it's the global platforms that are taking share, in large part because they can apply scale to what they're doing. They can apply best practices from around the world. It's not about digital versus non-digital. It's about globally focused marketers versus media owners versus non-globally focused ones. And again, deglobalization is a real thing, and that's going to have consequences. But in the present time, the global platforms are certainly taking share. I see AI and automation generally impacting workflows more than anything else, right? It's not that it's unimportant. It's just it's more automation. And yes, we can imagine all sorts of other changes, but it's mostly about cost efficiencies, as far as I see. And finally, and for this room in particular, I think for any industry that believes it's going through a period of change, the focus on generating profits and cash flow actually adds to your risk. If you think the world is completely predictable and stable, maximize that cash flow, pay out those dividends, do those share buybacks. But as someone who studies stocks and has studied them and studied the businesses, I think that that's only applicable in a stable and predictable business. That is not the case for so much of the advertising industry. All right, you can contact me here, Brian at Madison Wall. You can get free newsletters on Saturdays, and we have, of course, paid subscription advisory services as well. Thank you very much for your time. And now I think we are doing...